Hey guys, another fantastic face-to-face interview. This is, I think, the fourth face-to-face. First one, Imam Tawhidi, then Michael Sagner, Mufassal Islam, and today we have Dr. Bill Gairdner, who is joining us from the outskirts of Toronto. How you doing, Bill?
Very well, thanks. Yourself?
Great, thank you. Thank you so much. We've communicated in the past. Even there was such a desire for us to speak to one another that Bill's son recommended that we speak to each other. So, Bill's son, if you're watching, it is finally happening thanks to you.
Thanks, Bill.
So, I have a list here because I couldn't remember all the books that you've written. So, I brought with me some of the books that you've written, the latest one being The Great Divide, Why Liberals and Conservatives Will Never, Ever Agree. The Book of Absolutes, A Critique of Relativism and the Defense of Universals. The Trouble with Canada Still, Uh-oh Canada, A Voice from the Conservative Resistance, The Trouble with Democracy, and The War Against Family, and there are several other books. I thought we'd sort of do a tour of all of these different books. But the first thing I want to talk about is your incredible bio. Canadian Olympian at the 1964 Olympics. There was another very important event that happened in 1964. It's when someone truly important to world peace was born. Do you know who that person was?
Oh, man.
1964?
You're going to stump me.
It's a guy who's got olive skin and green eyes and who's staring at you.
God's side.
Yeah, there you go. So not only in 1964 were you in the Olympics, but I was born in 1964. You obtained your PhD.
It was a great year.
It was a great year. Oh, the God, 1964. You went on to obtain your PhD in literature, or in English, at Stanford University, undoubtedly because you couldn't get into Cornell University, my alma mater.
Oh, a good try.
You taught at York and then left academia, went into business. You chaired the Gairdner Foundation and founded Civitas, which is the conference that we'll both be at tomorrow. Where do you want to start? Let's start with your Olympian past. Tell us that story, incredible story.
Well, the Olympics, that was in Tokyo, 1964. And, of course, I had spent, at least 5 years preparing for that. One of them was here in Montreal. I went to McGill, and that was a bit of an unfortunate experience because when I walked into the gym and asked for the track coach, he came out, I forget his name now, I'm sure he's gone to meet his maker, but he comes out, how are you? And I said, I'm fine. He says, so what do you want to do? I said, I want to go to the Olympics. I want to be a decathlon man. He sneers and he looks at me, he said, hell, he says, you're too small.
Too small meaning too short or too light?
Small, you're not big enough, strong enough, whatever. And so I basically said, well, the hell with this. And I trained on my own the whole year at McGill. I never went to the track practice once, except once they needed an athlete for a meet against, McMaster or something. So I went with them. But other than that, I trained myself the whole year. And it was no fun. They had no indoor track. And, I would run up the stairs on the way to the university. I lived on Drummond Street. I would run up the stairs to the university. I would put the shot underneath the overhang of the stadium because there was no snow there. But there was snow everywhere. So I had to run maybe at 10 o'clock at night when the traffic died down on the streets. Wow. That kind of stuff, and lifted weights in my room and, all that kind of stuff. And
sort of a real Rocky story.
That was a Rocky story. And, I'll never forget some fraternity was trying to recruit me. And I was running down by the what do you call it, where they keep all the water up there, there's
Beaver Lake.
The reservoir. There's a big reservoir up there. And I'm running down from McGill, from the stadium area, down around to get down to the lower level. And as I come around the corner, there's this enormous snowdrift. And I go plowing into it head first. Couldn't stop myself, And this car pulls up, and it was these fraternity guys who wanted to recruit me. And I climb out of the snowbank, all covered with snow, and they're looking at me, and I'm going, I don't know, guys, if this is going to work. Though I did join the fraternity, but
you only lasted a year.
I lasted a year. Then I left, and I went to University of Colorado, and suddenly it was sunshine and warm weather, and big track team, lots of competition, so that was great.
And how did it go at you told me a story off camera. It didn't go so well.
I went to the Olympic Games. These are big dreams you have when you're a kid, right? And my mom and dad were there, and we thought, well, we better go somewhere to eat the night before the games where it's safe. It's going to be safe, maybe better food than the Olympic Village. So we went to the Tokyo Hilton, and my dad and I got terribly sick, terrible dysentery.
And the next day you were...
I was up the whole night. I lost about 12 pounds that night. And it was horrible. And we couldn't find the team doctor. He was in town with the geishas or something, you know. Finally, he gets back at 4 a.m. He gave me something you couldn't have today. He gave me some kind of opium pill to settle the cramps in my stomach. And I did compete. And I set a Commonwealth record in the decathlon, despite it all.
What could have been had you not been sick?
I don't know. Maybe I came 11th out of about 30 countries. You know, maybe I could have come 8th or 9th or something like that.
Okay.
I was a bit disappointed. But anyway, that's the breaks, you know.
For those of you who don't know, we have an Olympian in my own family. One of my brothers, David, represented Lebanon at the 1976 Olympics. Yeah. And then you were telling me that while you were in Japan, you then became a judoka yourself.
Yeah, I was so disappointed with track and field because of my sickness that I stayed in Japan for 6 months to try to find myself, you know how young men do.
Sure. And
I decided to take up judo, and one of my friends was Doug Rogers. He was Canada's silver medalist in judo, and he was 6'5", 260 pounds. And one day he threw me, and he didn't want me to hurt myself, so he pulled on my arm, and he pulled it right out of the socket.
Oh, boy.
And so I lost. I couldn't throw the javelin or pole vault anymore. So I basically said, to heck with this. I'm going to lose 20 pounds of muscle, and I'll just run hurdles. So I ran the 400-meter hurdles and the high hurdles for about 9 more years. I was Canadian champion for most of it.
And you're still in very good shape. So do you still train a lot?
Yeah, I'm a fanatical, not fanatical anymore, but I do a lot of cycling in the summer and a lot of cross-country skiing in the winter.
Amazing.
Still feel good, you know.
Very nice.
Yeah.
So then you, after Colorado, you went to do your PhD in English at Stanford.
At Stanford, yeah.
And so that would have been around the time when the great French charlatans were starting to come up.
Yeah,
Jacques Derrida, Michel Foucault, Jacques Lacan,
that's right.
all the scammers.
That's right.
Were you exposed to all those guys?
They were just kind of rearing their heads on the horizon, you know what I mean? They weren't really settled in yet. So I would say no, it wasn't mainstream yet. The critic I was supposed to work with over there was a man named Roland Barthes. He was truly bright, not like those other guys who was trying to...
Despite the fact that he was French.
Despite the fact that he was French, yeah, he was French. The French always go for the style.
I'm just kidding. I learned French before English, so don't send me hate mail. Go ahead.
And I speak French, and I read a lot of French, too. In fact, you'd be interested. 40 years ago, a little book called Le Voyageur Français ended up in my hands. It was a book about Canada, about 300 or 400 pages about Canada back in the day with the Indian life and the voyageurs and all that. And I had never read it. But about a year and a half ago, I thought I'm going to read this just to keep my French up, you know. So I started reading this book, and it was just fascinating. And so I said, I wonder if it's ever been translated into English. And I found out it never had, so I translated it myself. And it's with McGill Queen's Press now. They're just trying to decide whether to publish it or not. You know,
oh, nice.
Looking for reviewers. But when it comes out, you'll love it.
Oh, very nice.
Yeah.
So, I mean, was postmodernism, independently of these guys, was postmodernism sort of already part of the tool of literary analysis?
No, but I would say that, look, this was 1968, 69. It was just coming in.
Just coming in, okay.
Just coming in. And people were starting to talk that way. Relativism was coming on stream everywhere, especially in moral matters, and of course also in, you know, that was the kind of post-structuralist age, you know. I don't want to go too deeply into it here, but language games and, you know, the whole relativism of language.
Language creates reality.
Yeah, all that kind of thing, and the prison house of language and all that sort of talk, you know. So, well, that leads me actually to say something, to mention something which is interesting, because at the time I'd been doing some reading in Jean-Paul Sartre, you know, and existentialism. I was teaching some existentialism at the university at York at the time, well, afterwards. And I was in the elevator one day, and a senior professor was there, and I happened to mention Sartre's phrase that hell is other people. And he taught me a lot when he looked at me. He said, "Yes, young man," he said, "but so is heaven." You know?
But you didn't decide. Did you not want to go into academia?
I did. I went. I taught at York for 3 years in the English department, and then my dad had a family business which was failing, and he kind of went like this:
"You got to come home.
You got to help.
Okay.
You got to help, or the family's going to go broke."
So you left academia, went into business.
I said, "Oh my God!" I said, "You helped me for 10 years trying to get smart, and now you want me to make money? Right. Oh my gosh, you know." So I took over this business, and I guess I didn't know much about business for sure. Had to learn, you know, it's like the father who throws the kid in the water. You want to learn how to swim here. Right. Push him in the water.
No trigger warnings.
And if you're still here 15 minutes later, I figure you can swim. Right. You know, that kind of thing. So that's what I did. It took me 15 years to turn the business around. And after I turned it around, I thought my real passion is I want to write books. like The Trouble with Canada and The War Against the Family and this Great Divide book, which is my latest.
So let's start chronologically going sort of backwards. So Trouble with Canada. What was the trouble then? And then 20 years later, you wrote Trouble with Canada still.
Yeah, to see what
tell
happened.
us the...
Okay, well, I was at the breakfast table, and my wife was raising our 3 kids, or 5 kids actually, and she and I had 3 together, and she took on my first 2 like she was their own mother, and which was wonderful. And I would open the Globe and Mail in the morning and be reading it, and she'd see me fussing, and she said, "Why don't you stop complaining and do something about it?"
This is late 80s.
This would have been mid 80s.
Mid-80s, okay.
Why don't you stop complaining and do something about it? And I said, nobody can do anything until we know what the trouble with Canada is, and people don't know. And there's the title of the book right there, Trouble with Canada. So she said, "You're never going to do it if you wait." She said, "Just take your cup of tea in the morning. You're waking up early in the morning anyway with business anxieties. Go down to the study and start." Best advice I ever had. So it was happy times. I went and wrote my book. And it got rejected by 5 publishers. Finally, it got accepted by one of them through a kind of serendipity. And before I knew it, it was #1 in Canada. 2 months later, sold about 80,000 copies, and my name was all over the place. I was on the air like crazy. I must have done 300 shows surrounding that book and the next one. And all I can say is, and this is, by the way, a great thing about Canada, and those were the days when people wrote letters. They actually got a pen out, took the trouble of getting a piece of paper and an envelope and addressing it. I got some wonderful letters, you wouldn't believe it. Here's the typical one, I'll never forget it, from a truck driver in Sault Ste. Marie. He writes me a letter, and I open this letter, and I almost start to cry. I read this thing, it said, "Dear Mr. Gairdner," he said, "I'm just a truck driver from the Sioux, and I only had grade 8 education. And I got this here Trouble with Canada book in front of me, and I got a dictionary, and I got a yeller marker. Why, this whole darn book is yeller." That's what he said, you know. It was so moving, you know.
That's beautiful.
But what I was going to say was thousands of letters like that. I've never had an angry letter from a Canadian.
Before we get into the content of what was ailing in Canada, I want to look to the audience, and many of you write to me asking, how can I get engaged? What should I do? I'm not a fancy professor. I don't have a big platform. I'm not a famous politician. Well, Bill wasn't at that point. Through the egging on of his wife, he was able to start this, and then he gets a bestseller. So we all have a voice. We can all get engaged. Sometimes we don't reach the heights of Bill, but we all have a stake. We can all get engaged, and that's the lesson to take from that story.
Yeah, thank you. I think it is too. And I always tell people that when I'm giving talks, you know. It's like billiard balls on this table. Everybody's like kind of a billiard ball on the table of life. Right. There's 4 corners, you know. Call them what you want. I call them freedom, family, free enterprise, and faith. Those are the 4 corners. You just got to hit a ball. It's going to hit another ball, and that's going to hit another ball. The object is to get them all into those pockets in the corners. Right. You know? Right. Eventually. Right.
So what was the trouble with Canada then? What's the trouble with Canada now?
The trouble with then was that Pierre Trudeau was coming on stream. He was a bright guy. I don't think he was a brilliant guy, but he was a bright guy, well educated, at some of the wrong places, like the London School of Economics, which is a very leftist organization. Right. And I began to see that he was basically almost, not single-handedly, but almost single-handedly, through the power of personality, he was changing Canada from a very traditional common law-based parliamentary democracy into a very French-style, top-down dirigiste, you know, like directed from the top type of country in the French style. And with his Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which came in 1982, he basically threw the ball into the lap of the judges. We have a situation now where, I mean, I can't remember the last time our parliamentarians actually had a serious debate on, say, a serious moral matter. You know, instead what they say is, well, it's not going to pass the charter scrutiny. The judges are going to throw this out. Why even debate it? We'll kick it upstairs. Right. So we've been infantilized as a democracy. The people are infantilized because they're not being called upon to really discuss these things with heart, mind, and soul. They're not. And
the infantilizing starts actually at the university level.
It does.
Where now you can't say anything that might offend anybody. So that process really starts well ahead before somebody reaches the top echelon of politics.
Yeah, it didn't when I wrote that book. And, you know, I say in the Great Divide, the first couple of pages, I say what it was like when I was a kid. You'd sit around the dinner table with family and friends, serious people, and discussions would come up. They always did in our family anyway, about politics, morality, who knows what, you know. Whatever topic came up, if somebody, especially someone older than you, asked you what you thought about something, and you were like over 16, you better have some thoughts. Right. You know, And if you raised them and they were really stupid thoughts, you might hear, but it wouldn't be anger. It wouldn't be, how dare you say such a thing. It would be, here's what's wrong with what you're saying,
Right.
and here's why the argument doesn't hold up. Or if they were good thoughts, you would get praise for it, but you were expected to have opinions. Now, what's one of the reasons I wrote, for example, my book of absolutes, this critique of relativism? Well, I got tired of going to cocktail parties where I didn't know too many people. I'd see some fellow over in the corner. I'd walk over with my glass of wine and try to strike up a conversation. And I would try to say something that I thought was an indubitable truth.
Right.
And here's what I would hear, almost without fail. Well,
It's relative.
true for you, but it's not true for me.
Exactly.
I love this moment because I look them in the eyes and I say, well, it can't be true and false at the same time. One of us must be wrong. Why don't we talk a little bit and find out which one it is? You know what would happen? He'd go drink with someone else.
Right.
You know, casual, lazy, intellectually stuporous people. And I thought someone has to. So I wrote the whole book of absolutes as a critique of relativism.
Well, that book, which I think in the title has Defense of Universals, is really in my playhouse, if you'd like, because what I do in my work, I think many of our viewers know this already, I study human universals as a manifestation of our shared biological heritage. So there are many things that might differentiate the consumers from Peru and Bolivia and Japan, but there's a commonality. There's a bedrock of human universals. And I think you and I offline spoke about Donald Brown, the anthropologist who put together a great book titled Human Universals, where he sort of offers a very, very exhaustive list of things that are exactly the same across otherwise very disparate cultures.
Yeah, well, he and I communicated over the Book of Absolutes. This was in 2007. It was published in 2008 with your McGill University here. And one of the chapters in that book is called Human Universals, in his honor.
Right.
You know, it discusses a lot of his work and other work, too, which came on after that book.
Well, as you may know, in much of the social sciences, the idea that there might be some things that are common across cultures is so against the orthodoxy.
Yeah.
So there were all sorts of anthropologists and sociologists and other types who would argue that even the most basic instinctual responses, let's say facial grimaces that capture the 6 basal emotions, are different, right? So for example, this frown, they would argue there is some tribe somewhere, which is complete BS, where the frown means I'm happy. Because they're so desperate to not hang anything on the mantle of human universals.
That's right.
Everything is relative.
Yes.
How do you explain that someone could be so detached from these basic realities that the average 3-year-old knows to be false?
Well, you probably know all about the work of Boaz, you know, the anthropologist Boaz and Margaret Mead.
He started the whole cultural relativism.
Mead and people like that. Well, they all came into this world. He was a Jewish man who was very concerned about anti-Semitism in Europe, and what went on in Europe was terrible, horrifying. And when he came to Columbia and all the rest of it, I mean, one of the big deals was he wanted to preach cultural relativism and moral relativism. I don't think he was a relativist himself, morally, but he wanted to preach this so that people would stop discriminating against certain groups and ganging up on them. So he had a motive, which was a decent motive, you know. Yeah. But
I've actually argued exactly this, that they had noble reasons for actually building these edifices of House of Cards. So it was all BS, but it came from a noble place.
Yes. And he and a lot of the others, like Clyde Klucone and people like that, other anthropologists, they came around at the end and decided they had been wrong to sing that song, you know. But after their main work was published, it was kind of late.
And it had infected generations of students.
Yeah, so I went through university. The first book I got was Cultural Relativism, Cultural Anthropology, but should have been called Cultural Relativism because that's what the professors were teaching.
Did you ever read the book The Fateful Hoaxing of Margaret Mead?
You know what? I don't think I did.
You need to read that. So Margaret Mead was a student of Franz Boas, if I remember correctly. So she was sort of the one who really went out into the world trying to demonstrate that there are no human universals, so much so that she had supposedly found some Samoan tribe where all of the sex role were reversed. It was complete nonsense. And so there was a gentleman who wrote a book demonstrating how it was completely a hoax. So for those of you who are interested in this issue, I would highly recommend you check out the book.
Well, there was another book of that same ilk written by an Australian historian named Come to Me in a Moment. He wrote a book called The Killing of History.
Right.
And in The Killing of History, he has a chapter on Margaret Mead and the other anthropologists and how they were so off base, you know, like drawing conclusions and assumptions from their work in the South Pacific, you know, these islanders, when in fact Christianity had already been there for 300 years, you know, that kind of thing. The people had already massively changed.
Speaking of sort of departures from reality, last year, I appeared in front of the Canadian Senate, and then later I gave a talk on Parliament Hill, where I was trying to argue about some of the inherent dangers of Bill C-16, the transgender bill.
Yeah.
Not, of course, suggesting in any way that all people should not be treated equally and that all people should not be protected. That's a given. But rather, I was arguing that some of the fundamental premises in that activism were so flawed. As somebody who studies evolutionary psychology,
yes.
we start with the premise that there are two, if you like, phenotypes. There's a male and female phenotype. That doesn't mean that the transgender should not be treated with all of the dignity that they deserve.
Ordinary charter respect.
Right. But then I said, look, anything that I teach could ultimately be considered transphobic because, quote, I'm assuming binary thinking, male-female.
Yeah.
And the response of one of the senators, Senator Joal, was that I was being a pro-genocide activist.
It's terrifying, this kind of language.
I mean,
people
it's just
trot out,
unbelievable.
for a good argument, they trot out that kind of scare language, which is really too bad.
So now let's talk about your latest book, where you're basically saying that there is, in the Venn diagram, there is no intersection between the conservatives and liberals. Is it as dire as that?
Well, I'm going to explain why I wrote the book, and the metaphor I use. Metaphors are helpful, as you know.
Sure.
Is the guy standing on the street. And it's a beautiful day, beautiful buildings around. He's enjoying himself. Suddenly there's a big gash on the road. Buildings start to crumble. And he says it's an earthquake. Oh, my God, it's an earthquake. But, of course, it's not the earthquake. It's the rubble. It's the consequences of the earthquake. The real earthquake is in the grinding geological forces that he can't see. But a seismologist can see them, measure them, interpret them, tell you what they are, My book is trying to do a kind of ideological seismology. So, for example, what I'm trying to get at is the grinding of the ideological forces, which people can't see. What they're seeing is the rubble at the surface, political rubble, moral rubble, confusion, just like the guy with the earthquake. So what this book is trying to show is that there is, in fact, a real conflict in the Western world. There has been for a long time, maybe forever, but certainly since the 18th century Enlightenment and the counter-Enlightenment, which followed that, as between the liberal and the conservative. I call it the true conservative, because the liberal has become a so-called, what I call a modern liberal. The conservative is, if he's a true conservative, I mean, this starts with Aristotle and comes up into our tradition through, Hume and Burke and all sorts of other writers, like you and me, maybe, into our tradition. But the differences between these two sides is considerable. For example, take the question of human nature. Is human nature malleable, or is it not malleable? The modern liberal would tend to say and believe very strongly that human nature is malleable.
More than malleable, it's infinitely malleable.
Yeah, and so the laws must be created to reconstruct human nature to meet certain political and ideological objectives of the liberal. The conservative says, no, the laws should be created to conform to consistent with human nature, not to change human nature, because you can't change it. The French have an expression. They say, chasser la nature, elle revient à quatre pattes.
Right.
So you chase nature out the door, she comes back on all fours.
Comes back hard, yeah.
And always will.
There's a great quote by E.O. Wilson, the Harvard evolutionary biologist.
Yes.
I hope I get the quote exactly right.
He's
an entomologist.
Bug doctor.
He's a bug doctor, exactly. He studies social ants. Yeah. And actually his quote is in reference to social ants. He says, communism/socialism, great system, wrong species. Right? And that's
go to the ants.
That's exactly right. Social ants, communism is great. You've got you've got two hierarchies. You've got the queen, and everybody else is equal. In the human context, we have hierarchies. Communism doesn't fit with our human nature.
Yeah. Well, it's funny you say that, because when it comes to hierarchy, and I write about it in The Great Divide, where I talk about authority. People confuse power and authority. I always say, look, there's three basic levels you have to be concerned out there. There's government, which has power. What's power? Well, it has power over you. They can kill you. They can force you into jail, punish you, The middle level is civil society. That's where we have families, churches, social organizations, charity groups, sports teams. Call it what you want. But their form of control, these are three different types of control I'm talking about. Power at the top with the state. At the social level, it's authority. Right. The authority of your mother and father, the authority of your priest, the authority of the coach on your track team, the authority of your boss at work. But that's not power, because you can walk out of any of those social organizations. You can walk away. You pay a price maybe, but you're free to walk away, And then at the bottom level, we have the individual. And the individual form of control is self-control. Those are three different forms of control, which people confuse all the time. In fact, John Stuart Mill, famous libertarian, he always called public opinion a form of power.
Right.
which is not. Public opinion is a form of authority. People shame you with public opinion. They praise you with public opinion, but they can't jail you.
Right.
Now, tax you.
One of the things that I'm often asked by my followers is, we get the sense that you're a classical liberal guy, but what are you exactly? And the reason why I typically don't answer them is not because I'm trying to be coy and
I thought you were asking me. But
no. I'm going to answer it for me, and I'm going to ask you sort of a comment about this. Is that I really don't like to be boxed into a label. Not that I'm doing a deconstructionist. I don't buy labels. It's because I really take ideas in a piecemeal manner, so that on some issues you might consider me someone who is very socially liberal. And on other issues, you might consider me very much as in the conservative camp. So for example, when it comes to death penalty, I'm actually a supporter of the death penalty. I think that if we find your DNA in the rectum of 10 children who've been killed, then I really have absolutely no moral trepidation about killing you. And I think right. I think that's a totally natural position to have, and it's fine to instantiate that reality.
I agree with you.
Now that would make me a super conservative guy when it comes to open border immigration with folks who don't share the values that we hold dear in Canada. Then I would be considered, quote, super conservative. Although I think it's very much of a true classical liberal position. Yes. On other issues, I'm very much socially liberal. So, for example, you and I might disagree on. I really don't care about gay marriage. Do whatever you want. I don't care. I don't even want to comment on it. Live and let live. So I don't like to be pigeonholed into a position because I'm an ideas guy. Yeah. What's your position on this? Are you similarly?
Okay, I would say that fiscally, financially, economically, I'm a libertarian. I believe in free trade. I believe in we need laws against force and fraud. But otherwise, I think the government should get the hell out of our business lives and stop pushing us around like they do and over-regulating everything in sight. In moral matters, I'm a kind of Burkean conservative. The last 3 chapters in this book are the really tough ones, at least people who read it tell me, because they talk about the divide between liberals and conservatives on the issues of abortion, euthanasia, and homosexuality and gay marriage. There's nothing about God in those chapters. There's nothing about tisk. There's arguments on both sides, and you get to read them and think through which are the best arguments. I think people find them tough, and the liberals don't come out winning.
Right.
And it's not me. I'm trying to argue both sides. I try to give the liberal argument as fairly as the conservative argument. But I think any rational person at the end would say, these conservative arguments here are way better than the liberal arguments, because the liberal arguments are all about the triumph of the will over nature. I can change my gender through my will, Right. I can kill my baby because I choose to kill my baby. If the father decides he wants to keep it and I don't, the hell with him.
Right.
My will rules, I have a friend who said to me recently when the euthanasia came along, he's a wonderful professor of British history at York University. Oh, Billy said, it's a culture of death, this euthanasia thing. What's abortion but pediatric euthanasia? And now we're talking about seniors and disabled people, and you know where it's going to go. It's a really slippery slope. And I said, Ian, it's not a culture of death. It's a culture of will. And the last thing people have control over these days is their own death, and they want it.
Right.
It's the will, triumph of the will over nature. Now, this has been going on a long time in the West. You can find it in the Renaissance, and you can find it in the Enlightenment period. A very strong insistence that the will controls everything. I mean, the French thinkers, Diderot and all the rest, during the French Revolution, they restructured all of marriage. They said, well, what is marriage? It should be a freely chosen institution by both parties. If there's no meeting of the minds in this marriage, then there is no marriage. So the husband or the wife can walk in and say, I divorce thee.
Right.
Right?
Wait, in Islam,
which means there's no contract anymore.
In Islam, there's a law. It's called
3
talaq,
times.
right?
Yeah.
Talaq means divorce, and as long as the husband simply pronounces publicly talaq 3 times, we're done.
Yes.
So there you go.
Well, in the West, we haven't. At least I didn't grow up that way. Most people did. In marriage, the idea of marriage was 2 to make it, 2 to break it.
Right.
Right. Now it's 2 to break it, 2 to make it, 1 to break it. Even if the other spouse is a completely observant spouse, he or she can be punished by the unobservant spouse simply because of
irreconcilable differences.
Irreconcilable. Well, just because of their will, though.
Right.
And people say irreconcilable differences when they haven't even tried.
Right. What do you think of the open immigration policy of Canada?
I tried to start an organization a few years ago with my son-in-law called Immigrants for Canada. And we had 7 principles. And the first principle was Canada first, country of origin second. if you're going to come to Canada, this is the way you have to behave. We're not going to play the game that all cultures are equal, because they're not. Whether it comes to language, whether it comes to political...
you mean cutting off women's clitorises is not as good as not cutting them off?
I'm not for cutting off clitorises.
That's very racist of you, Bill.
No, anything like that. You know, what I'm saying is, okay, I made a distinction in my book, The Trouble with Canada, still between what I call deep culture and skin deep culture.
Right.
Skin deep culture is sushi, Italian cars, you know,
linguistic
or
diversity,
German cars,
gastronomical diversity,
French movies,
yeah,
all that lovely stuff that we all enjoy. You know, a certain amount of it is wonderful, you know, until it maybe buries your own deep culture, you know. But deep culture is different. It's about language, it's about literature, it's about politics, it's about religion, it's about philosophical and historical background to the formation of your people, right? And when you bring people in and you don't ask them to learn those things and assimilate to those things, okay, country of origin, language of origin, habits of origin, practice them in your own home with your own social groups. But when it comes to Canada as a whole, we expect you to come on board with our deep culture. And if you go to war for Canada, even against your own country of origin, we expect you to fight for Canada, right? That's a big deal.
Yeah.
No one's saying that.
So do you remember when our current Prime Minister, who I might argue might be even worse than his father, when he was a parliamentarian, and he was very, very indignant at the use of the term barbaric to describe barbaric practices.
Yeah.
So he wasn't concerned about the barbaric practices of child brides and honor killings and female genital mutilation. He was concerned that people would call these barbaric. I mean, how broken must your moral compass be for you to take that position?
It's very broken, and yet, isn't it interesting? We live in a time when people have gone from connotation to denotation. It used to be language used to be denotative, connotative. You know, it had many meanings, complex meanings, you know, which we could talk about. But then we went to literalism, right? And for example, in our human rights tribunals, it's all about, you know, what you said. And when I was a kid, we would sing the song, "Sticks and stones will break my bones, but words will never hurt me." Now we talk about like words can hurt you, you know.
Words are violence. Are literally violence.
Yeah, that's right. And so the whole of the Human Rights Tribunal structure is based on this idea, and that's why speech is shutting down in this country. You can't tell jokes which ridicule anybody. What's a joke that doesn't ridicule somebody?
Exactly.
No, really.
Well, how about if you engage in self-deprecation, then you are being violent against yourself.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Right?
Yeah, that's interesting.
But speaking of words as violence, in my Canadian Senate testimony, I pulled out a pamphlet, or at least I quoted from a pamphlet from Harvard University's LGBTQ office, where they were arguing that to promulgate, quote, fixed binaries and biological essentialism, close quotes. Fixed binaries means male, female. Yeah. Biological essentialism is to argue that, you know, humans are biological beings. Yeah. That to promulgate these ideas is a form of transphobic systemic violence. Yeah. Literally, not metaphorically. Yeah. And so I said that basically every single word that I utter after I walk into class and say, "Good morning, class, my name is Professor SAAD," would be considered transphobic systemic violence.
Yes.
And that's when the guy accused me of being pro-genocide.
Listen, I hate to say it, but the country's shutting down. I wrote an article on my blog. I encourage your viewers to look at it. It's just my name, williamgairdner.ca. There's an article there called Canada's Soft Totalitarianism. I never thought in my life I would have to say that my country has gone soft totalitarian. When I was a young boy, my mother handed me a copy of Life magazine. It was a big magazine in those days. There was a huge centerfold picture of Tiananmen Square after the massacre. There was 1 million Chinese students there, all dressed in black uniforms, same black tunics, same black pillbox hats. And there was a sea of red over their heads. They were all waving Chairman Mao's Little Red Book. Right. Now, I have read Chairman Mao's Little Red Book. Very few Canadians have ever read it, but I have, and I can tell you it's a crazy book. It's communist religion, you know, and they're all waving it in the air. And I turned to my mom and I said, "Wow," I said, "these kids are my age. I feel sorry for them. They're all brainwashed. Look at this," you know. Showed her the picture. And now in Canada we have this kind of enforced uniformity from the top. You know, my own son-in-law, wonderful son-in-law, is a lawyer. He's a brilliant lawyer, and he's being asked by the Upper Canada Law Society, which
to adhere to certain progressive principles.
They're asking him to sign that he agrees, and not only that he agrees with, but that he should promote women's reproductive rights. Well, he doesn't believe in abortion. He doesn't believe it's a reproductive right. It's actually blocking reproduction. It's killing babies in the womb. Why should he be forced to sign this? You see, and
Law Society that has to lose in a legal challenge. No,
they're saying no, because our own prime minister is walking around the country like a peacock, telling everybody that it's in the charter. It's not in the charter. You know, it's read into the charter by courts. That's what I meant earlier when I said we've been infantilized as a nation.
Right.
Judges are now reading. You know, what's a charter? Charters are not self-interpreting. They're just not. What does equality mean in the charter? Nobody knows. A judge has to tell you. Before that, the common law told you what equality meant. And there were practices that were followed and acts that were struck down in the name of equal rights of citizens. Now it's an abstract term, which means anybody who gets on the court can read their meaning into it. And then that becomes part of the structure of constitutional law in Canada. And that's why there's such a fight. There always has been in America because they had their own kind of charter over the years and centuries. Canada didn't. And since '82 we do. And now who's on the court really matters because we have a bureaucracy. Parliament has been infantilized too. So,
how come you never got into politics? You've got the you look like, is it Terence Stamp? There's an actor.
He played in.
Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I do. He played in that.
He was in Priscilla, Queen of the Desert. I don't know if you know that. Maybe you don't. It's
Billy Budd. He played in the Billy Budd movie.
He's probably around your age. Yeah.
Now he is. Yeah.
You look hauntingly similar to him, or he looks hauntingly similar to you. So you got the movie.
And you look like Richard Burton, you know.
Well, there you go. There you go. And actually, she's off camera, but my wife might be even more beautiful. He was married to Elizabeth Taylor, right? Was that him?
That was one of his wives.
There you go. But I beat him because I got a prettier wife.
Yeah, you do. You do.
Bill is looking at her right now.
Hard not to look.
So how come you never got into politics? Did you ever think about it?
I'll tell you why. And I've been asked this. I don't mean to boast, but I've been asked this a lot in my writing life. If somebody gave me the keys and said, "Look, you've got 2 terms, 8 years, 10 years, whatever it is, to turn Canada around," it would be fun to try. But the reason I never wanted to try, I'll tell you, is because I profoundly believe that if I had the keys and could do whatever I wanted to get this country turned around and back on its feet again and off its damn head, you know, I don't believe for a moment that the day I left office, it wouldn't come snapping back to where it is today. Because politics is downstream from culture. It's culture, stupid, not you, but it's culture. And so that's why I wrote books. I decided to write books to try to change people's minds.
It's so funny that you say this because, if I may say, some people have asked whether I can, and some pretty influential people, whether I should get into politics. Yeah. And then other people have written to me and said, you probably will have more influence being a professor and a public intellectual than you ever will as a politician, because ultimately the system will shackle you. It doesn't matter how irreverent you are to the process, you're going to be shackled. So that's exactly what you're saying.
Yeah, and I'll tell you 2 things about that. That's why we have Civitas. I was the founder of Civitas.
Yeah, tell us about that.
It's the only organization in Canada which once a year draws together the most important libertarian, classical liberal, and conservative thinkers in this country. They're broadcasters like you, they're authors, they're teachers, they're students. People who want to discuss and debate these issues, and you've seen the program. You're one of our speakers. It's going to be a terrific program, you know. So I did that because I wanted to change the country culturally, you know. And I wrote my 12 books for the very same reason, you know. And
do you? Let's hopefully, as we move towards the end of the interview, we started with some sort of dire, ominous clouds. Do you see any clearing of the clouds? Is there any optimism, or are we screwed?
I'm really sorry to say, I don't think I've wasted my time. Because even one of those billiard balls matters to me, because he's going to hit another one and so on. And those letters those people write to me matter to me. But when people today, I'm going to be 78 in the fall, when people write to me or talk to me and say, how have you felt all these 3 decades trying to change the cultural tone of this country? Here's what I say. I say, I feel like a man who's been standing on a rock in a leftward drifting sea. In the distance there are ships, and they're drifting to the left in the fog. But I can hear the voices on deck. And you know what they're saying? Look, there's a man out there drifting to the right. And that's what they're saying. Like, I have drifted to the right.
That's not a very optimistic...
no, it's not.
Yeah, okay.
And I've done as much as I can about it, and all I can say is we have a duty to be optimists. I am very much an optimist. When I coach kids, sent them off on university track scholarships to the U.S. or whatever, things I love to do, I was always optimistic. And people accuse me of being infectious when it comes to optimism. But if we want the truth on where Canada has been going in the last 30 or 40 years, strictly a leftward drift, with a remnant in which you and I are members, and many others who will be at Civitas tomorrow, and there's millions of them across the country. Okay, but they're not the, they're not the silent majority, the silenced majority.
Right. Well, I was actually going to ask, do you think that there's a way to compel the silent majority to be more active participants in the battle of ideas so that the ship could be very quickly redressed?
Here's what I say to people. I had a speech in Atlanta last week. I was in Atlanta giving a talk to a group, and afterwards they said, what can we do? These liberals are terrible people. I said, no, they're not bad people. They're good people with bad ideas.
Right.
And your job is to learn the good ideas. Here they are in my book. At the end of all 14 chapters, there's a table showing you what the liberals are thinking at the deep subterranean level and what the conservatives are thinking. Buy the book, learn these things, and go argue with these people. And it's because they're good people that they will rise to better ideas. But until you give them a better idea, they're going to reject what you say.
Right.
You have to persuade them it's a better idea. And I think most of these are better ideas.
Right. Any projects that you're currently working on that are not yet public that you'd like to use this forum to promote?
Not yet public.
Or that are not yet...
I got two books in the works. The French Traveler, which I'm looking forward to seeing getting published with McGill. And I've got my book, Disruptive Essays. It's with Encounter Books in New York. I'm waiting for their decision. That kind of thing. And I'm going to start on an autobiography soon because I'd like to tell the story of my life.
Will there be a whole chapter to you having met me?
More than a chapter.
What a pleasure to meet you, Bill.
What a pleasure to meet you.
We'll continue this conversation off camera.
I love it.
Thanks, guys. Make sure to share. Cheers.